World leaders attended the Chinese parade to mark the victory in the war against fascism. President Xi Jinping highlighted the Chinese people's major contribution to the salvation of human civilization and the defense of world peace with immense sacrifice in the war. Time to bring in our panel. From Beijing, Victor Gao is chair professor at Soochow University, and here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a history professor at American University. Welcome to both of you. Victor, China marked the 80th anniversary of its resounding defeat of Japan with a massive parade. President Xi, in his address, said the victory was achieved under a national united front against Japanese aggression. He said the Chinese people made a major contribution to the salvation of human civilization and the defense of world peace with immense sacrifice during the war. How significant was China's role in defeating fascist forces during World War II?
Well, China actually made the biggest and greatest contribution to the effort which resulted in the unconditional surrender of Japanese fascism in 1945. The reason was that China started the war of resistance against Japanese aggression as early as in 1931. And for about 10 years, leading all the way up to the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, China fought against the Japanese aggressors more or less alone by itself. And throughout the 14 years of war of resistance against Japanese aggressors, China suffered a total loss of about 35 million people. And Japan occupied up to about half of the landmass in China. And for a while, they managed to close off almost the total length of the Chinese coastline. So China kept fighting, pledging that China will fight to the very last person in order to drive out the Japanese aggressors from the sacred soil of China. And after Pearl Harbor, China and the United States became allies with each other, and we fought against the Japanese aggressors shoulder to shoulder, back to back. China never surrendered. Just imagine if China surrendered, then Japan could draw on all the human capital resources in China and concentrating on defeating the Americans in the Pacific War. That will result in a world completely different from the world that eventually witnessed the Japanese unconditional surrender in 1945. So in this sense, I think China continuing fighting against the Japanese aggressors for 14 years in a row, and then becoming comrades in arms, fighting together with the American troops, shoulder to shoulder, led to the ultimate complete defeat of the Japanese fascism. In a sense, in the European theater, the former Soviet Union really suffered a lot, made a huge contribution. In the Asian Pacific theater, China suffered a lot and made the greatest contribution. Of course, the Americans entering into the war against Japan accelerated the final downfall of Japan and also made huge contribution. But I think the success, the laurels should be equally shared between China and the United States, leading towards the final defeat of Japanese fascism. This should be the real verdict of the war of victory against Japanese fascism. And I hope more and more people, especially in the Western countries, in particular, especially in the United States, will realize how important was China's contribution, especially working together with the United States in the final victory.
Anton, good to see you. As I said in his address in Beijing to this very important anniversary, President Xi noted that the Chinese people made a major contribution to the salvation of human civilization and the defense of world peace. Now, there were many, many leaders from the global south at these commemorations. President Vladimir Putin of Russia was there as well. When we see that kind of unity, that kind of camaraderie, what was the message that was sent to the world?
What Victor absolutely correctly noted, the emphasis on China's pivotal role in defeating Japan in the Pacific. I see the events in Beijing over the past few days as part of a complex of events that we've seen unfolding over the past several days, beginning with the SCO meeting in Tianjin. This is very, very important because what the Chinese are doing is that they are leveraging this very important anniversary into a message about altering the system of global governance. This is not just about reminding the world that the Second World War in Asia looked quite different from what Europeans, Westerners, especially Europeans, think of when they think of the Second World War as a conflict between September of 1939 and then May of 45 in Europe and then August of 45 in Asia. This was a much longer process. For the Koreans, by the way, the Japanese became a presence in 1910. So there were two generations of Koreans who lived under Japanese occupation by the time the Second World War ended. What's interesting to me is that the Chinese are now making this a platform for changing world governance, because the way that the Second World War ended was by marginalizing the Asian countries and centralizing global governance in Europe. The Yalta-Potsdam system, which came out of the Second World War, was agreed to by the Americans and the Soviets, for the most part to the exclusion of the rest of the world. It was a Western system, and that's exactly what is beginning to be renegotiated right now.
Victor, these ceremonies brought up memories of a tragic time in China's history. We look at the Japanese invasion, the brutality that the Japanese inflicted on the Chinese, and of course, as you've pointed out, the millions of lives that were lost. What can you tell us about Chinese resilience, Chinese resistance in the face of this Japanese attack?
Well, I think 14 years from 1931 to ultimate victory in 1945 was a very long 14-year period. However, I think the Chinese nation became very much united, especially after we witnessed the massacre in Nanjing, or the rape of Nanjing, where the Japanese aggressors killed more than 300,000 Chinese civilians, as well as unarmed soldiers. And it revealed the true color of the Japanese fascism. They not only want to kill the Chinese nationals, they also want to obliterate the Chinese culture, to wipe out the Chinese civilization, which by then had existed in this world for more than 5,000 years. Now, the Japanese thought they could win a quick victory over Chinese, conquering China, quelching the Chinese resolve to resist, for example, and enslave the Chinese nation. But exactly the opposite happened, because Chinese nation became very much united. And in this process, Chairman Mao Zedong published a booklet called On Protracted War, saying that while Japan did have technological superiority, military superiority above the Chinese people, by the end of the day, will eventually prevail against the Japanese aggressors. That really still instilled a lot of hope and optimism in the minds of the Chinese people at the darkest hours in our long struggle and war of resistance against the Japanese aggressors. And that also further made up the Chinese resolve to continue to fight against the Japanese aggressors. Now, eventually, China and the United States became allies, and we fought shoulder to shoulder, as I mentioned, and back to back. And international cooperation really helped the Chinese people eventually in achieving the great success against the Japanese aggressors, including heroic legends like the Flying Tiger, headed by General Chennault, for example, as well as the Doolittle Raiders, who bombed Tokyo, but many of them crash-landed in China, including the Japanese-occupied parts of China. And many Chinese people, without knowing any of these American pilots, came to their rescue. Many actually were eventually butchered and killed by the Japanese aggressors, claiming that they actually helped save the American pilots. So I think the ultimate resilience of the Chinese nation, leading towards the complete defeat of the Japanese fascist, is multifaceted. It depended on the Chinese people themselves. It depended on Chinese people's cooperation with the United States in particular. And the Chinese people and the American people really treat each other as brothers and sisters, as comrades in arms. And all this combined together explained why China eventually prevailed against the Japanese aggressors.
Victor, in his speech, President Xi called on the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA as it is known as well, to provide strategic support for the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. He urged the PLA to build itself into a world-class force and resolutely safeguard national sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. How important is the PLA in today's China?
Well, the PLA is a very unique organization. It swears its allegiance to the Communist Party of China. And in every company's level, there is a party branch built into the company command system and above. Now, the PLA has already become the most important and most effective instrument at the hands of the Chinese people for defending peace, defending China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, expelling any enemy at home or abroad, especially from abroad, and also in achieving the ultimate goal of reunification. Now, all this bodes well for China, because without maintaining peace at home and preserving peace, without maintaining stability at home and preserving peace abroad, China can barely develop, especially since 1978, when China opened to the outside world and embraced reform, political as well as economic, of all kinds. All this had a big underpinning supporting all this transformation of China. That is the steely will of the officers and the soldiers of the People's Liberation Army, which provided such a backbone support for peace, for stability, for development in China. And by now, China has completely transformed itself, because China needs the PLA to defend peace for itself, and the world also needs PLA to exercise leadership role in expelling any fantasy that one single country can dominate above all the other countries.
Anton, China and the Soviet Union suffered massive casualties during World War II. These were the two countries that suffered the highest number of casualties during the war. The Soviet Union saw almost 27 million dead, 27 million lives lost. Of course, both countries played a massive role in the Allied victory over fascism. How would you assess China's contribution to the defeat of fascism?
Well, it's an enormous contribution. The Chinese tied down the Japanese in the Far East, preventing a two-pronged attack against the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviets had had their border clashes with the Japanese between 1932 and 1939 and defeated them. But if the Japanese had reconstituted themselves, if they had managed to overrun China and ruled Manchukuo, the puppet state that they set up in Manchuria, and then joined Hitler when he attacked the Soviet Union in the largest invasion in the history of our species back in June of 1941, it would have been impossible for the Soviet Union to face off both powers. And with the Soviet Union destroyed, the rest of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, by the way, would have been at the beck and call of Hitler's Germany, and Asia would have been at the beck and call of Japan. So the two powers fighting the same enemy, yes, with very important material aid from the United States, which neither side has ever denied, neither Moscow nor Beijing, this made an enormous difference. And that's why the Soviet Union maintained positive relations with China after the Second World War, and then, of course, into the communist period after October of 1949.
Victor, let's listen to what President Xi said in his speech about the emergence of China as an economic, political, and diplomatic world power. Let's listen.
The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is unstoppable. The noble cause of peace and development for humanity will surely prevail.
So, Victor, what was the message that President Xi sent to the world in his address?
Well, I think the message President Xi sent to mankind as a whole, to all the countries, roughly about 200 of them altogether, is a very strong message, meaning nobody can really derail China's peaceful rise, and China moving higher and higher up the level to be a major player in the world is unstoppable. It's irreversible. And then China, either before when it was smaller and weaker, and now when it is stronger and more powerful, or in the future when it will become more powerful and more effective, will never seek hegemony, will never dominate above all the other countries. And this sets China very much in sharp contrast with the other big power. And in that sense, I think President Xi Jinping is very explicit in saying that China defends peace and develops peace. And China wants to seek economic cooperation with all the countries, and China respects all the other countries as an equal rather than try to impose its ideology, its value system, its way of doing things on other countries. Now, this message is in particularly short supply right now because many countries right now face the maximum bullying and the manhandling by the other big country, especially in launching this indiscriminate tariff war against almost all the other countries in the world. And China rises up to the occasion, defending free trade as China has committed to defending peace in the world.
Victor Gao, Anton Fedyashin, thanks so much to both of you for being with us. To continue our conversation, we welcome now Peter Kuznick. He is a history professor at American University. Peter, great to see you.
See you.
Peter, what's your view of the events that ended World War II, and what is your assessment of the role that China played in that?
Now, the Chinese have been fiercely resisting the Japanese since at least 1937. Some could trace that back to 1931, when the Japanese first took Manchuria, but it was really 1937. And the estimates are, and it varies quite a bit, most Western scholars believe that the Chinese lost about 13 million during World War II to the Japanese invaders. But the Chinese Communist Party claims that actually 35 million deaths were resulting from the Japanese invasion. That's an astounding figure because we know that the Soviets lost 27 million in defeating the Germans. So that's why these countries take the commemorations of World War II, whether it's in May in Russia or now in China, so much more seriously than the United States takes it. Because throughout most of World War II, the Soviets were confronting 200 German divisions, while the United States and the Brits were confronting 10 German divisions between the two of us. That's until June of 1944. But that second front that Roosevelt had promised Stalin we would open up before the end of 1942 gets delayed for another year and a half, and the Soviets suffer horrifically at that as a result of the delay in opening up the second front. So the Chinese play a very important role in terms of holding down the Japanese forces. And because the Japanese were confronting the Chinese, they were not able to carry out their invasion against the Soviet Union, which if they had done that instead of pursuing the Japanese empire in Asia, might have had a different outcome in the war. So the resistance and holding down and forcing many, many Japanese deaths at a horrible cost was very important in terms of the overall Allied victory against fascism in World War II.
Now, in the war against Japan, the United States joined China in that resistance. An American general, Joseph Stilwell, he fought alongside the Chinese and led U.S. forces against the Japanese. His great-granddaughter was invited to China to attend the parade, the commemorations, the 80th anniversary commemorations of the Chinese victory. This is what she had to say. Let's listen.
History in the United States is not as well taught as it is here in China. So I believe it is our duty as the descendants of General Stilwell to increase the education and the knowledge about what happened during World War II.
Peter, does she have a point there? Does there need to be a reappraisal of how this part of history is taught here in the United States and other Western countries?
Yes, Anand, that's absolutely a valid point. The Americans believe that the United States won the war in Europe almost single-handedly. But so do the Europeans. Right after World War II, 57% of the French thought that Russia played the major role, or the Soviets played the major role in defeating Nazi Germany. 57%. Now that number in France is 7%. Across Europe, as of a decade ago, 13% of the Europeans say the Soviets played a major role in defeating Germany. So people don't learn any history. And to prove this point, I did an anonymous survey with college students, most of whom were A students in high school. And I asked them, how many Americans died in World War II? The median answer I got was 90,000. So they were only off by 300,000 in the ballpark. I asked how many Soviets died in World War II. The median answer I got was 100,000. They were only off by 27 million. They don't know anything about World War II. They can't understand the Cold War. They can't understand what's happening now in Ukraine. If you don't understand history, you can't function. As Santayana said, a country without memory is a country of madmen.
Nell Callaway, who is the granddaughter of the Flying Tigers founder, General Chennault, wrote a piece which was published in the People's Daily in China, and she said this. She said, history shows us that cooperation is powerful and achievable. We don't have to agree on everything, but we must continue to manage our differences to build a peaceful and prosperous future for generations to come. Do you think those kinds of sentiments are heard in Western capitals around the world today?
Not in Western capitals right now. The big project in the West is to demonize Putin and to create this proxy war and to condemn any step toward peace or settlement of this horrific war or of what's going on in the Middle East right now. But I look at what Xi Jinping said. He just said, today mankind is faced with the choice of peace or war, dialogue or confrontation, win-win or zero-sum. You know, what was happening this week in Tianjin and in Beijing is very exciting to most of the world. When we saw Putin and Modi holding hands and meeting together with Xi Jinping, we saw the future of the world. To the United States and the Europeans, they think they're the future, but they are really not the future. At the peak, Europe might have represented 40% of global GDP. Now Europe represents 15.2% of global GDP, and that's going down to about 12% by the end of this decade. What you see is the emergence of the global South. China, India, each with 1.4 billion people, reconciling their differences now. And in some ways, they, just like Russia and China, have been pushed together by the backward policies or the warlike policies of the United States and Europe or NATO. And so the world has got a choice. Are we going to go in the direction of global development, of peace, of collaboration, creating a different future for the planet? Or are we going to go in a more warlike direction? I certainly hope it's the former, and not the latter.
Peter Kuznick, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Anand.
And that's where we need to leave it. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.